Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is James Monroe, Part 4. Today we'll wrap up the life of James Monroe, the fifth President of the United States of America. We stopped last time in 1822, and Greece, the Greek people, the country of Greece was fighting for independence against the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of folks in Europe and in the United States were very supportive of that because of their affinity or their interest in the great thinkers from ancient Greece. You know, unlike today, people don't really. This is something we probably could revive. We should revive today our knowledge of the ancient Greeks, because Americans back in the early 1800s were very knowledgeable, and therefore they were very interested in the Greeks becoming independent, and they knew about these famous Greeks like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And of course, Athens was considered the birthplace of democracy. And the Olympic Games were started by the ancient Greeks. So anyway, that was very interesting. And actually the Americans supported the Greek independence movement, and Greece did become an independent country. Also in 1822, President Monroe, he was in his second term as president, and he authorized the dispatch of a U.S. frigate, in other words, an American ship, naval ship, to the northern outreach of the Antarctic Peninsula. Wow, down to the bottom of the world. And this was done to, quote, strengthen our forces along the American coast. So you imagine, wonder what they were doing down there, or how long they stayed. But you can see the United States was on its way to becoming a global power, because we were patrolling Antarctica. Also in 1822, a very dramatic year, most of the countries of Latin America became independent of Spain, including Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. They all became independent of Spain. The leader, and Brazil as well, became independent of Portugal. So virtually almost all of Latin America, except for Cuba and Puerto Rico and a few other places. The leaders of these independence movements included Simón Bolívar in northern South America. He led the movement for countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru maybe. And then José de San Martín was the guy who led independence for Argentina, and Bernard O'Higgins led the independence movement for Chile. Interesting, guy named O'Higgins. He must have been a descendant of an Irish immigrant. And the United States recognized these countries. And James Monroe, President Monroe, had a tough time dealing with. It was a very delicate situation, because during these independence movements, which had been going on for 12 years, folks in Latin America fighting Spain for independence. These guys would send representatives to the United States hoping for recognition, and the U.S. didn't want war with Spain, over this. So there was kind of a delicate thing, but we did. Americans were supportive of these revolutions, and actually, the revolutions in Latin America were inspired by the American War of Independence against Great Britain. So, in December of 1823, President Monroe gave a speech to Congress in which what became known as the Monroe Doctrine was introduced to the public. And the whole idea was that European countries needed to stay away from North and South America. At least new colonization was he was saying we wouldn't support. We'd be against that. Now Canada was still a British colony, and Jamaica in the Caribbean, and Cuba was still Spanish, and Puerto Rico was Spanish, and the Bahamas was British, and so But he was saying that there would be these countries that had become independent. The U.S. was supporting their independence, and they were not open. He said, we don't want further colonization. We don't want Spain or any other country to come and take their independence away. That the United States. This was the sphere of influence of the United States. So American power was growing. And this is what he said in part, quote, the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subject for future colonization by any European power. Harlow Giles Unger, the tremendous biography, who wrote this wonderful biography of James Monroe, wrote this, quote, "On December 2, 1823, Monroe strode into Congress to deliver his 7th annual message to that body. He had aged noticeably, still tall and fit, but his hair had grayed and deep worry lines had etched his face. Still wearing knee breeches, silk hose, and buckle-top shoes, while his audience wore ankle-length trousers, he seemed out of place, out of the distant past, come to ensure his own legacy. Members of Congress stood to applaud and cheer, some of them trembling with awe as they watched him make his way down the aisle, the last of the Founding Fathers. To maintain peaceful, friendly relations, he said, his voice rising, he proclaimed United States supremacy in the Western Hemisphere, describing a line in the ocean around North and South America, and warning the rest of the world, as his Virginia regiment had the British in 1776, don't tread on me." So that was, that's a very important speech. The following year, the Marquis de Lafayette visited America, the great hero, French volunteer in the American Revolution. There was a national celebration because Americans were very grateful to France and specifically to Lafayette because, he'd played a major role in getting French support in the war. And he himself, had been wounded and been involved in many battles fighting Great Britain. New York City saw its first ticker tape parade with flower petals. And Lafayette had this to say in the United States when he came to visit. "I have stood strong and held my head high whenever, in the name of the American people, I have proclaimed the American principles of equality and social order. The greatness and prosperity of the United States are spreading the light of civilization across the world. A civilization based on liberty, on resistance to oppression, and on the rights of man." So he was getting older, so he wanted to come visit. He was actually having severe financial problems as well. And he visited President Monroe at the White House, and they had a very touching reunion. And remember, after Lafayette had been severely wounded at Brandywine, the Battle of Brandywine, and after that battle, James Monroe tended his wounds. He took care of him. They became very, very good friends. And in the French Revolution, remember, James Monroe and his wife had come to Paris during the Reign of Terror, and Lafayette's wife was in prison. And James and Elizabeth Monroe saved her life. Elizabeth went to the prison, risked her life during that crazy, violent time, and was able to get her released. And he got her out of the country to safety with an American passport to Denmark. So they had a very, they were wonderful friends because they really, and Monroe had done so much for them. And Lafayette, had done a lot for the United States. James Monroe had this to say late in 1824, quote, "Having commenced my public service in my early youth and continued it with few and short intervals, I have witnessed the great difficulties to which our Union has been exposed, and admired the virtue and intelligence with which they have been surmounted. From the present prosperous and happy state, I derive a satisfaction which I cannot express. That these blessings may be preserved and perpetuated will be the object of my fervent and unceasing prayers to the Supreme Ruler of the universe." That year, 1824, was a presidential election year, and James Monroe was stepping down after his second term. He'd had enough, and he was pretty tired. 5 men tried to become president in 1824, including Henry Clay, William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and John C. Calhoun. Now, it was a controversial election because actually none of the candidates received enough electoral votes to win. And that threw it, and although Andrew Jackson had the most electoral votes. So because he didn't have enough to win, it was thrown into the House of Representatives who voted and who had to decide. And Henry Clay, threw his weight behind, told his people, his delegates, to vote for John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams was elected the 6th President of the United States, even though Andrew Jackson received more votes. It was very controversial. And then later, John Quincy Adams named Henry Clay as Secretary of State. So this was considered a corrupt bargain. It's very sad. I think that was a mistake. John Quincy Adams made a mistake. He probably should have said, well, the people's choice. Since Jackson received the most votes, Jackson should be president. Maybe he should have told Henry Clay, no, you should give your votes to Jackson. But he didn't do that. And so anyway, and then John Quincy Adams had a very tough time as president. He was very unpopular because he really was not the people's choice. Lafayette was in the United States on New Year's Day, 1825, and he came to the Congress and gave a speech. And he said this, quote, "To the perpetual union of the United States, it has always saved us in time of storm. One day it will save the world." So, in March of 1825, John Quincy Adams was inaugurated as the 6th President of the United States, and James and Elizabeth Monroe returned to Oak Hill, their elegant mansion built south of Leesburg, Virginia, and he resumed his friendship with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, although Jefferson only had a year to live. So he was back at his farm where he had cattle, horses, 1,000 sheep, timberland, wheat, corn, rye, and oats were grown. His secretary, Egbert Watson, wrote this about James Monroe, quote, "He was one of the most polite men I ever saw, to all ranks and classes. It was his habit in his ride of a morning or an evening to bow and speak to the humblest slave he passed, as respectfully as if he had been the first gentleman of the neighborhood." So yes, James Monroe was a slave owner, but he respected the slaves. He treated them well. He treated them with respect. There was a get-together in 1825, and that included James Monroe and John Marshall, his childhood friend, a guy he'd been gone to school with and was in college with, and had shared a cabin at Valley Forge, longtime friends. And John Marshall gave a toast to James Monroe, and he said this, quote, "I am proud to recognize one of my earliest associates, one with whom I have frequently acted in the most trying scenes, for whom I have felt and still retain the most affectionate and respected esteem, without a taint of that bitter spirit which has been too long the scourge of our country." So that's interesting. He's talking about, how much he really loved, John Marshall really loved James Monroe. James Monroe was a good man. And this last part he talks about, the fact that a lot of times people, really mistreat each other. And especially in politics, there's some be very hard feelings. In his final years, James Monroe was having severe financial problems. Actually, he had spent a lot of money in Europe as a diplomat and was not compensated by the U.S. government. And he had a perpetual struggle trying to get his expenses paid. His wife Elizabeth she had been in poor health for a long time, actually going back to the years in the White House, and she had trouble fulfilling her role as First Lady. And then, very sadly, one day she fell into the fireplace. That's a bad place to fall, and she was badly burned. So this was really, so he was having hard times near the end of his life. And also that year, Monroe fell from his horse and was badly hurt. He was 72 years old. That year, John Quincy Adams was defeated by Andrew Jackson in the presidential election, and then James Monroe, who was, they were very close. John Quincy Adams was a big help to James Monroe when he was president. And so Monroe wrote John Quincy Adams a letter, and he said this, quote, "I shall always be happy to see you here, and wherever we may chance to meet. I shall through life take a sincere and great interest in your welfare and happiness." In 1830, Elizabeth died, and this was a disaster. Really, it was the end of the world for James Monroe because they were so close, very, very close. He was really grief-struck, and devastated by her death, because they were very good friends, very close partners. So he decided to sell his home of Oak Hill, and he moved to New York City to live with his daughter, because they felt he shouldn't be alone. He needed to be with his daughter. John Quincy Adams wrote about Elizabeth's love for James Monroe, quote, "This lady, of whose personal attractions and accomplishments it were impossible to speak in terms of exaggeration, was for a period of half a century the cherished, affectionate partner of Monroe's life and fortunes. She accompanied him on all his journeying into this world of care." They had a wonderful marriage. She was a very good good lady. And then John Quincy Adams continued, "She united the more precious and endearing qualities which mark the fulfillment of the tender relations of domestic life." James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831 in New York City, the 55th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. His funeral was at St. Paul's Church on Lower Broadway. In 1858, his remains were moved to Richmond, Virginia Cemetery, and he was buried nearby later President John Tyler and also Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. After his death, President Jackson ordered a national day of mourning, with guns at military posts firing every hour from noon till sunset, and ending with a 24-gun salute. You know, when Andrew Jackson exceeded his orders in Florida, and there was a lot of people who were critical of him, James Monroe, although diplomatic, was supportive of him. So Jackson was appreciative of him. And they had worked together on the organizing the battle at New Orleans in the War of 1812, that great victory. Harlow Giles Unger wrote this about James Monroe, quote, "James Monroe was the last of the founding fathers. Born and raised on a small Virginia farm, Monroe had fought and bled at Trenton as a youth, suffered the pangs of hunger and the bite of winter at Valley Forge, galloped beside Washington at Monmouth. Recognized by friends and foes alike for his plain and gentle manners, Monroe proved a fearless and bold leader in war and peace. As governor of Virginia, Monroe brought education to illiterate children by establishing the first state-supported schools, and he enriched their parents with a network of publicly built roads that let them speed the products of their labor to market. Monroe took office as president determined to lead the nation to greatness by making the United States impregnable to foreign attack and ensuring the safety of Americans across the continent. Secure that they and their families and property would be safe, Americans streamed westward to claim their share of America. The land rush added 6 states and scores of towns and villages to the Union and produced the largest redistribution of wealth in the annals of man. Never before had a sovereign state transferred ownership of so much land and so much political power to so many people not of noble rank. To ensure the success of the land rush and perpetuate economic growth, Monroe promoted construction of roads, turnpikes, bridges, and canals that linked every region of the nation with outlets to the sea and to shipping routes to other continents. The massive rebuilding program transformed the American wilderness into the most prosperous and productive nation in history, generating enough wealth to convert U.S. government deficits into large surpluses that allowed Monroe to abolish all personal taxes in America. Monroe's presidency made poor men rich, turned political allies into friends, and united a divided people as no president had done since Washington. The most beloved president after Washington, Monroe was the only president other than Washington to win re-election unopposed. Political parties dissolved and disappeared. Americans of all political persuasions rallied around him under a single star-spangled banner. He created an era never seen before or since in American history, an era of good feelings that propelled the nation and its people to greatness. Although fierce in the face of enemies, Monroe hid what one congressman called a, quote, good heart and amiable disposition. After the Civil War, as the wounds of war healed, Americans could still look to the vast western wilderness that James Monroe had opened for his countrymen to build new homes, new towns, and a new, stronger nation. The spirit of America's last founding fathers still beckoned to them to join the nation's march to greatness. John C. Calhoun had this to say about James Monroe, quote, "He had a wonderful intellectual patience and could hold a subject immovably fixed under his attention until he had mastered all of its relations." See, that's the thing. Monroe was patient. He didn't just make up his mind. He wanted to get information. A lot of these political issues are complicated, and you need to really know a lot more. So he was a hard worker, and he would be patient to try to figure out what was the right thing to do. There was a reception at the White House one time, and he was asked by a friend, quote, "Are you not completely worn out?" And Monroe replied, "Oh no, a little flattery will support a man through great fatigue." He's a funny guy. James Monroe had this to say, quote, "In a government founded on the sovereignty of the people, the education of youth is an object of the first importance. A people well informed on the subject of their rights, their interests, and their duties would never fall into the excesses which prove the ruin of ancient republics." President Monroe was in Boston on July 4th, 1817, and he toured Bunker Hill, and he said this, quote, "It is impossible to approach Bunker Hill, where the War of the Revolution commenced, with so much honor to the nation, without being deeply affected. The blood spilled here aroused the whole American people and united them in a common cause in defense of their rights. That union will never be broken." John Quincy Adams had this to say about James Monroe, quote, "He was entitled to say, like Augustus Caesar of his imperial city, that he found her built of brick and left her constructed of marble." Historian and biography Harry Ammon wrote this about James Monroe, quote, "In spite of his rather formal manners, Monroe had a rare ability of putting men at ease by his courtesy, his lack of condescension, his frankness, and by what his contemporaries looked upon as his essential goodness and kindness of heart." Gary Hart, who also wrote a biography of James Monroe and was presidential contender himself in 1984 and 1988, wrote this, quote, "Monroe's mind was orderly and logical, moving methodically from evidence to conclusion. Wisdom, intensity of focus, and sound judgment were the hallmarks of his mind and character. As a 19-year-old Virginia lieutenant charging the Hessian guns at Trenton in 1776, nearly at the cost of his life, he exhibited the unswerving sense of duty, courage, and honor that would characterize his life." So I read 3 books, 3 biographies of James Monroe for these talks. The first was "The Last Founding Father" by James Monroe and a Nation's Call to Greatness by Harlow Giles Unger, 2009. And the next, James Monroe, The Quest for National Identity by Harry Ammon, 1971. And finally, James Monroe by Gary Hart, 2005. So to conclude, James Monroe is a wonderful hero in American history. He played an important role in the Revolution himself, risked his life, almost died at the Battle of Trenton, the key battle that turned the war around, the American Revolution, the victory that we needed. And he was with Washington there, and later at Monmouth Courthouse, and he played maybe his most important role was in the War of 1812, when everything was falling apart after Washington City was burned and New England was threatening to secede, and he helped successfully to defend Baltimore and New Orleans, 2 very important victories. He did a lot for Virginia, promoting education, and he coordinated with William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson to make the West safe for American settlers after victories had been achieved against American Indians. So he really, he was a good guy. He was a good man. He worked hard, and he sacrificed. He died bankrupt, actually, and he represented America's interest in a tough situation, the French Revolution, really something. So the thing about his life, I think, is what's important is he had good character. He was a good man. He was honest. He worked hard. He was brave. He was dedicated to his country. He sacrificed financially through his public service. Really did a wonderful job. God bless James Monroe, a man who served his country well. The next president we'll talk about will be John Quincy Adams. In the meantime, God bless you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find a good history book to read, and I'll see you next time.